Hi, folks. Welcome, everybody. Before we kick off into the guts of the matter, a little bit about ProdPad before we get started. Now, this was originally a tool built by myself and my co-founder, Simon. Simon and I were both product managers. We needed tools to do our own jobs. And you know what? Nothing like this really existed. So we needed something to keep track of experiments we wanted to run, ways we were going to hit our business objectives, how we're going to solve our customers' problems, and basically keep tabs on all the ideas and feedback and stuff that made up our backlog. So building ProdPad gave us control and organization and transparency, and it wasn't long before we started sharing it with other product people around us. And so today it's used by thousands of teams around the world. Now, as you might imagine, for a product like this, it's free to try. You can jump in and start using it. We even have a sandbox mode where it has example product management data. So you can see how things like lean roadmaps and OKRs and experiments and ideas and feedback all fits together in a product management space. And our team is made up of product people. So start a trial. We'd love to have you jump in, try it out, let us know. We're constantly posting new updates to it. And this is based on the feedback from everyone who uses it. So yeah, absolutely. I can see Jason used to post this to hosts and panelists. He says he loves sandbox mode. People just use it to get a sense of what a good now, next, later roadmap looks like, or to try to make sense of different artifacts. So it's completely free to use. Jump in and start using it. So with that, I want to introduce our guest, our very special guest. This is Lucy Spence. And Lucy is a dear friend of mine. I've known her from the very early days of Mind the Product, when it was a little product tank and little product camp. And Lucy came along and has done some blindingly good talks over the years on a number of different stages that we've been proud to host her on. Lucy started her career in UX at Love Film. Anybody remember Love Film? Before entering the world of product management. And she's currently product director at Appvia, but has previously held senior product manager positions at both Amazon and Compare the Market. She's really passionate about product, and she has a great track record of successful delivery. So everyone, say hello to Lucy. Thank you so much for joining. It's great to have you here and great to have this conversation. Now, this actually came out of a conversation that we were having some time ago when we're talking about what kind of things we could talk about if you and I jumped on this fireside. And you'd mentioned an article that you'd written not too long before, which was called Dragon Thinking. Is your product strategy really up to scratch? So it's an article filled with metaphors and joy. It's an absolute delight to read, with some illustrations as well. So love that about Lucy. She's always adding a little bit extra zing to her presentations. But Lucy, do you want to tell us a little bit about the dragon thinking and how you came across applying it to product strategy?
Let me give you a bit of context around what prompted the article.
Yeah.
And I think at the time I was working somewhere that was really battling with prioritization, trying to figure out what to do. I think we had some strategic planning events, and we probably had something like 300 engineers and 180 odd stratequick priorities, and you can just do the sums on that and figure out that's not
priorities, is it?
Yeah. Sorry, they'd actually culled quite a lot to get to that, pare it down to that list. And I was trying to think about that, and also going through that process of, we'd had a changeover of a few people in leadership, and I guess something that I'd heard on and off throughout my career was this idea of, that's not strategic enough, or I need to see the strategy, and you put something together and they'd be like, that's not strategy, and it looks like this, and you'd be like, I don't really recognize that as strategy either. And it's like this looming sort of strategy, and we end up as an organization paying consultants quite a bit to come and talk to us and capture everything we said and play it back to us, which the cynic in me says, well, great, they told us what we already knew, but actually they did the work to pull all of that together. But again, they came back with a list of things. This is like 10 years worth of work.
Right.
How do we work through this? And I was kind of like, and I was probably a little bit burnt out and a little bit cynical at the time. And I was just like, it feels like I'm just dealing with dragons that just go, ooh, there's a pot of gold, let's go after that. And they can't decide between the pots of gold, because all of these things have some level of value. None of them were bad things to do. There were probably a few that were bad things to do. You're not going to get 180 initiatives and not have a few things in there that you should probably think about. But there was someone in the company that could defend each of those things pretty well. And some of it was regulation and some of it was all sorts of things. And this is actually really hard because there sort of wasn't really that overarching product strategy that would help people filter. And so you've got a lot of these things that a lot of them are already in flight. And so there's a cost to stopping them. There's a huge overhead in trying to manage it and having the kind of the arm wrestles between peers about which is the most important, how the hell you'd actually deliver any of this stuff. And so huge amount of wastage in terms of discussion on this stuff because there probably weren't the overriding principles to guide. And so that was the context for it. And I was like, how can we make, and people were asking me as a senior person, it's like, what does strategy look like in this context? And so I was wrestling with it a little bit myself of what would be useful here. And so I was just thinking about it in those terms. And I guess there are a couple of, where it's ended up, it was like there's a little bit of a framework at the end. And I don't usually do frameworks because I've tried so many different frameworks. I love them. They're really good for enriching your thinking. You never actually manage to implement one properly. It's like they move you forward and you're a bit scrappy and you go, okay, I got 30% of the way. That's useful. Like now we've got a different problem. Doing the rest of this probably isn't going to help, I think. Or maybe that's just me being a little bit scatty and moving on to the next new shiny thing.
But you know what? You know what? Actually, I've heard something similar around frameworks. Like product managers, the more senior you are, the more frameworks you've tried, the more frameworks you've been exposed to. And no one sticks to one particular framework. It's like having a pocket full of different ones that you can deploy at any one point in time. And so if it gets you, it moves you that much further. You know, a lot of these frameworks are just around facilitating the conversation to get the information out of people in a way that's structured, in a way that the team can understand what's happening and why.
Yeah, I agree. And it was funny listening to, I was at Mind the Product last week and listening to Martin Erickson talking, and he was saying, there are over 100 different documented strategic frameworks that you could apply. And the one he likes to use is from 1969. Yeah. Strategy isn't a new thing, but it is something that's difficult for people to grasp and wrestle with, I think.
And for people wondering, that one from, was it 69? It was the SWOT, the humble little SWOT analysis. Your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats still holds. Yeah. But there was something like a couple hundred since then that have been documented as strategic frameworks.
Yeah, and it's this sort of idea of strategy with a big S, which one wants to do because you think if you do strategy with a big S, you get paid lots of money. And maybe you do, and maybe you don't.
I think that's what the people who are getting paid to come in and play back the stuff you were already telling them to them, that's exactly what they do, strategy with a big S.
But it's that sort of thing of, okay, big strategy is great, but you only need one big strategy for the company. And if every individual product manager is getting told, be more strategic, be more, hang on. Yeah. We're like, how many products have we actually got here? Aren't we just, and so you then get down into sort of the more detailed, lower S strategy of what the hell are you actually doing, which is fun and games. And so because there obviously aren't enough frameworks, I decided to come up with my own.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lucy. Throw that one on.
If you need another thing to have a play with because you're a bit bored, feel free to crack this one out. No, it was something I was thinking about at the time. I think there's very much a kind of the grand strategy of the point of the principle of strategy is how do you create competitive advantage or lasting competitive advantage, and where do you get real leverage out of your business? And there are books like The 7 Powers, which kind of go into that in quite a bit of detail around business things that kind of generate huge leverage, things like network effect or branding, or things where you've got significant switching costs and things like that. And that's like, they're all really good things to think about. I think they're quite, for me, they're good frames of reference, but actually there aren't that many people. A lot of that is determined by the industry you're in, what you're doing. Guess what? If you're a social network, it's all about network effect. There are sort of dimensions of other things. But a lot of that is actually very much around determined by the industry and the business model and what you're doing. And unless you're in quite a small company, 90+% of PMs probably won't get a huge level of influence over that sort of thing. There are various different ways of doing it, but I like the defend, expand, and innovate model. There's sometimes it's called zones, sometimes it's called other things. But it's three horizons of, if you're making money now, what do you need to do to keep making that money? And if you're growing now, what do you need to do to keep kind of maintaining the growth that you've got, which is the sort of defend idea. And then there's expand, like how do you reach new market segments? How do you expand your customer base? Is it international expansion? Is it a new segment? Is it new? What is it? Is it a new channel that you're exploring? All of that kind of stuff. And then there's innovate, which is like, how do you actually disrupt what you're doing and change the offering of your product? And you don't have to be playing in all of those three areas at any one time, but it's not bad to think about. And so it was, but you talk about that, and whilst I can explain that now, it's all pretty theoretical, isn't it? And so I was, okay, if we got these dragons, what's the alternative to being a dragon? Because if I'm a dragon, I'm just like Smorg and I'm building this hoard, and then little Bilbo comes along and he starts stealing my fucking gold. And I've got to now defend my gold, and I can't go out and find more gold because Bilbo will come in and nick it while I'm doing that. Yes, I have read far too many fantasy books and various things like that. The alternative was this idea of strategies. This is how civilizations got built. Look at history. This is why there are major cities developed where they've got good access to water or to transport. There's usually some resource that they were originally able to capitalize on, that they then became part of a trade route and that sort of thing. And so it was building out that analogy as how you have to think about what your situation is, and you can use this kind of model of defend, expand, and innovate across those different powers to bring a bit of almost as filters to your backlog to then go. I often think, like, people go, I don't really know what my strategy is. Well, look at what's in your backlog and then try and bubble that up and summarize it. Because often you might not quite have the strategy in place, but the stuff that you're doing is leading someplace, and you can reverse engineer out the place that you're going to from looking at what you're doing. And then you can work out whether that's actually a useful thing to do or whether you need to shift it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And this defend, expand, innovate concept really jives with me in my thinking of what happens to large companies. I think they become dragons, as you say. So this idea that you've got these large companies and they've built up their market share, they've built up the revenues, and they're complacent to actually doing much with it, because as long as they're growing just a little bit, quarter on quarter, month on month, year on year, oftentimes these are quite happy to just continue holding on to their hoard. But as you say, like, there's always going to be startups nipping at their heels. There's always going to be like Bilbos coming in and stealing away their gold and disrupting their big pile. And so these companies have to either think about how they're going to expand and find new hoards or add to their hoard, or innovate, find new ways of maybe not collecting gold, but maybe collecting other commodities that might be useful, for example, whatever it is, but to keep ahead of the market.
I think particularly as a lot of us are digital product managers, we're working with technology, and a lot of the value of our product is based on technology. And unless you manage that correctly, technology gets old and experiences get old, and someone coming in new has newer, cleaner technology. They can move faster, and they've learned what didn't work in your original kind of architecture or your original experience, and they've moved forward from that. And so continually staying on top of that is really tough. Not many places do it.
And technology is getting easier and easier to replicate. You still need humans involved right now, but they've got the tools to basically take most technologies and replicate them. Because what are we actually doing besides a whole bunch of pretty complex CRUD apps? They're all the same sort of bones, and there's nothing to say that these things couldn't be recreated faster and faster going forward. So if technology is your moat, it's not much of one.
No, it's a really tough moat to maintain. If you want to be maintaining a moat in technology, you need to be at the very bleeding edge, and you need to be paying the people who are doing their PhDs and inventing the new technology. Because if it's just writing code, we've got, Copilot and things like that, where people are saying, I can write code 6 times faster than I used to be able to. It's like humans we can't scale and progress at that rate. So it's fascinating to see what will be lasting. And you see it with companies now. So think about like Facebook, one of the world's biggest companies. But who here is confident that they'll still be a player in 10 years' time?
I don't use it anymore. I do use their peripheral products. They've bought up everything else. But I could see that definitely taking a dive in the next 10.
Because they've got network effects, as soon as that tips and starts to decline, it becomes pretty difficult to reverse. And so you have those challenges.
This is arguably what they did and why they paid so much for Instagram. Like at the time, the acquisition was massive. It's in hindsight, it now looks completely obvious, but it was building out a different moat, because it's not on technology. It's on the people that you're able to connect with. They bought WhatsApp. That's another, they've got fingers in every pie now.
And it's not, sometimes it's for the people, but people don't hang around that long. Particularly if they're a startup going into Facebook, I would imagine. I don't know. I'm just having a sort of approximate guess there. But it does help Facebook do is it means they don't have to spend time defending against those things. And they could invest in things like the metaverse. And the reason why they're investing so heavily in the metaverse is because they know that Facebook itself as a product isn't going to last for that long. It's like, because what happens when when people start to disappear and the ad revenue goes, suddenly the stock drops. You can't employ as good of people because you can't attract them with big stock options. And suddenly, aside from, completely balking the world's democracies and probably and doing incredible societal damage in many ways, you've also then got a business that's not really functional as well. And so like pretty big price to pay to blow up democracy to then have a company that only lasts for 15, 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know which company I
am not suggesting that it was ever okay a price to pay to have a successful company at the cost of what they've done. Just so if anyone's unclear about what my opinions are on that.
One of the companies that I would absolutely bet on is Microsoft. People give Microsoft crap all the time, but honestly, I think it's got its head screwed on. If you look at what they've acquired Skype, which at the time was actually the world's largest social network. They've acquired LinkedIn. They've acquired GitHub. Like, who's there that they can't reach? Oh, and Xbox as well. If you consider all of those users, if you consider all of that, like their strategic steps have been massive, and I think going to be game changing for them in the next 20 years.
Yeah, they've definitely. Microsoft are an interesting one because they do some consumer stuff, but they really like playing to corporates. That is their bread and butter.
That's who has the money.
But it's also if you've worked in an office environment for the last 20 years, you have probably used Microsoft Office for a majority of that time. It's actually really difficult after a while to switch away from that.
Yeah.
How many big corporates actually switch to G Suite? Not many.
No.
Startups, yeah, sure, we're all using G Suite, but actually the big players, it's like you've got the IT support there, and there are so many things that you can build off that, and no one else has really got the same foot that they've got there. Amazon, on the other hand, they've got retail.
Right.
Got retail.
Everyone.
Yeah, playing to the corporate market versus Amazon have got retail and use that as their way to leverage things. I remember one of the things that I worked for Amazon Video, Prime Video at the time, or no, Amazon Instant Video at the time. And one of the things, and we're talking about strategy, one of the things that like I'd worked for them for a couple of years, and it was like, and there was always this thing about is video. We were behind Netflix. Our offering a bit relative to Netflix, and we were bundling it in with the Prime subscription. It was like, is this really going to fly? What's the point of this? And one of the VPs just went, everyone in the world who already reads a book probably has an Amazon account. Who are the people who don't read? What do they do? they watch TV. So we're doing video. And I was like,
Wow.
oh, okay, right. Now I'm on the same page. Because we were just thinking, is this going to cover its costs? Because we were spending like serious cash on content.
Lots of zeros.
knowing I think there was the first, I was there the first year when they spent $1 billion on content for the year, and we weren't making anything like that. It's like, how is this? And there were some financial models that say, no, we have increased engagement with Prime, and Prime Video users buy more through retail, so it's not quite as bad as it is, but it's just like, oh, you're spending huge amounts. But actually, as soon as someone said that, I was like, yeah, okay, I get it now.
And it's actually fascinating that you were there at that time, because it's when companies take risks like that. This is a company who's willing to invest and basically have their results dip down and look bad for a while in order so that they could take advantage of the steeper slope that's across the valley. So many companies get stuck in this local maxima where it's, they've been climbing up and they're at the top here. And either it declines or they get marginal gains, right? They just sit atop this little gold pile that they've made, and they're not willing to take that dip down and say, actually, there's a bigger hill here. In some companies, the culture there, it would mean that the CEO would get fired for their bet not turning out by the next time the quarterly results come out. Whereas a company like Amazon was forward thinking enough to say, actually, you know what, this is a risk worth taking. And it's really great that they were able to explain to you what it was they were thinking behind that as well.
Yeah, it's funny. We talk about big bets and little bets and things like that, and people go, everyone's thinking about experimentation. The kind of one of the things that stood out to me while I was there was the iPhone came out and spent $250 million on developing the Fire Phone, maybe sold like less than 1,000 handsets or something like that. I think it was in that realm. Probably one of the more spectacular product fails ever. Yet when someone pointed out and went, Fire Phone only cost the same amount as 3 series of Top Gear, the Top Gear presenters, the Grand Tour. So they paid as much for Jeremy Clarkson as they paid for the Fire Phones. That's actually just small bets for Amazon.
That's worth a punt then, wasn't it?
It's like
it could have worked.
They're making bets like that all the time, and they're not just, they'll have probably 20 or 30 7-figure bets. I don't know. I have no idea across the business. There are probably far more than that, but at any point in time. Then you get the really big bets, which are like Prime Video, where we are going to invest billions in this, and we're not going to know whether it's the right thing to do really until we've modeled out what spending $1 billion on a single TV series looks like, which is where they are now with Lord of the Rings. Or no, Rings of Power.
Rings of Power, yep.
The rings get remarkably little attention.
Spoilers.
Someone's mentioned Google Stadia.
Oh, Google Stadia.
Google sometimes just so spectacularly terrible at product management. I'm sorry. Obviously, they're very successful as a company. They've done some very good things.
Just because we're seeing their failures, and it's fun to pick on them going, this totally blew up. But actually, if you think about the bets that Google has made bets on things like maps and mail and other things. They were originally just a search product, and those ones absolutely sailed. They're doing a great job with that. And then other ones spectacularly
with maps. But think about like Google Hangouts, Google Chat, Google Duo, Google. How did Zoom ever get successful? Zoom got successful because Google missed the boat. They had 3 products trying to do exactly the same thing, and everyone just got really confused by them.
Yeah, somebody's actually pointed out the hard decision between choosing Fire Phone as an initiative or Jeremy Clarkson, like Top Gear, as a product decision. I mean, how do big companies deal when they've got so many big, chunky, potentially impactful initiatives and make decisions between which ones go and which ones don't?
I think with that, if you followed that one through, Fire Phone would have been in the Kindle, the hardware division, and Jeremy Clarkson would have been in the video space. So they would have had different VPs, probably reporting up to the same VP. And so there's one person sitting there and looking at the annual plans. Bezos it would go right, those decisions would go right the way up to Bezos to get to be involved in them, and they use the same process. There would have been a PR FAQ written about those. Bezos would have reviewed them and scrutinized them. It's up to those leaders within the business to kind of, these are the strategic initiatives we're doing, and they're judged on their merits. There's no real point in comparing them, because if they can fund them in their different areas, you don't have to choose between them. And it's probably looking and going at something more kind of akin to that, to a strategy framework of going, have we got enough in the boxes of innovate, defend? What are we doing? Firephone was a defense mechanism against smartphones, where you have Google and Apple with control over that market. And Microsoft, I think at the stage, was dancing around the edges.
Yeah, no, that's it.
They wanted to play in there. Did they pick the right strategy for how to enter that market? I think the results speak for themselves. But they'd done something similar with the Kindle Fire, and it had actually worked. And it actually worked, because they came in with something, and it was targeted very much to people who couldn't afford an iPad, and had probably 80% of the functionality. Wasn't as pretty, but it had worked for them. So they were trying to repeat that, and that's a reasonable bet. Sorry,
yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the key things to remember there is that they didn't have to make the decision. They had such a big hoard of gold that they could do both.
Yeah.
Did I break up?
Yeah, you did. No,
right,
but I caught that last bit. I've just seen one of the comments come up, and I think I know the background to this. There was someone was saying one of the reasons that Google PMs, or Google is so interested in, or at least why their PM function might not be working as well as it could, is because people are promoted when they launch things, but there's not actually a lot of benefit in training and developing products. And there's a lot of incentives can always skew behavior, and there's usually some fairly skewed behavior in places. When we're talking about things like Stadia, though,
good point.
The other thing is that people do get rewarded for putting out fires once they've become fires, generally, rather than preventing fires, because if there are never any fires in your area, it just looks like people are like, what are they doing? They prevented the fires before the fires. They made sure there were no fires that actually appeared. That's not as visible, and to get recognized for doing that is a lot harder. And unless you have people looking for it and know what's going on, you have to have really smart leaders who can identify people who are doing that and make sure they're getting elevated.
Good point. Incentives play such a role in what a company actually does with their time and with their people. If people are incentivized to launch new products, or in smaller companies ship new features, the incentives are all about that burn down and velocity and getting tickets out on time, getting stories built, then you're going to end up with a whole bunch of stories built, a whole bunch of launches, a whole bunch of stuff being made. But doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's incentivized to make sure it's the right stuff, or track through the stuff that was actually finished and see that it actually worked. That's the unglorious work that product managers should be doing. We should be carving out time to do, which is the not just building stuff, but like taking stuff away. We're not just builders, we're curators.
Yeah, it's really hard to take stuff away. It's really hard to justify the effort. It's almost.
Have you ever killed a product?
I've killed features.
Yeah.
Often more through mismanagement than being entirely intentional about it. I was reflecting on this the other day. There was something that we had a migration that we needed to do, one platform to another. The technology was out of date. This was on living room devices, and so I had to have the right sort of technology underpinning it. And so we were rebuilding our entire app. And obviously doing that, you get to a point where you're getting to diminishing returns. You start with the big features and you're almost going back to your MVP of what is it? How do I compare an app load time of 60 seconds reducing to 15 seconds, but we're going to cut away these features. And this was in video. So if they can watch a video after 15 seconds, as opposed to waiting 60 seconds, which most people will not hang around for because they'll think something's broken, that makes a difference. And so we cut out a significant section of the product.
This actually reflects back to Martin Erickson's talk at Mind the Product the other day, when he's talking about the decision stack and the principles that underpin and why it's important to have really good principles. I reflect back on the one that he highlighted, which was Google's principle of fast is better than slow. Or there's another one, which was like the user breaks the tie, or we focus on the user. And it was things like this where it's actually, when you are stuck between two product decisions, these underlying principles are often the things that do break that tie.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I always find I've tried to sit down and think principles first. My experience is that's a very good way to intellectually exercise yourself and not achieve very much, because you tend to create artificial scenarios in your head to test these things against and get into all sorts of hypothetical debates. And actually, when you come to it, when you're in that spot, was all of that thinking super helpful? Sometimes you need to actually be in the hard place for it to crystallize and go, we now have a choice between these two things.
Yeah.
What are we going to do, and what is the cost of doing that?
Yeah. And there's always this extra context that is possible to consider in any sort of framework.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, why frameworks end up falling over.
Yes. Frameworks are great, but when you have to learn, when they take more than, you have to learn how to apply them. It's jobs to be done. It's that wonderful thing where people explain, no one wants a hammer. They just want a hole in the wall. And then someone else, they don't actually want a hole in the wall. They want to hang their picture, or they want their place to look like. And all of this makes huge amounts of sense. And then you go and look at the frameworks. Well, there's quite a lot here, and I'm not sure I really understand how to apply all of this. And now I've got to teach everyone else how to do this. And I might be doing it for the first time. And now we've got to trot off to a training course. And now we come back and we've got different interpretations. And all the while we're focusing on the process. And if it's prompting good conversations about what you're doing, that's absolutely fine. But when you start to spend more time talking about the process, and the reason that I'm a bit critical about this is because I'm one of those people that will fall into talking about process. And so this isn't actually moving us forward necessarily. Sometimes there are just, what are the contextual problems we have here, and what is the next step that we need to take forward, and who is it that we need to engage in this?
Yeah.
Do we know what is right?
Yeah, and also accepting that done is better than perfect in so many contexts. You can't get away with it in every industry, in every space, but done is better than perfect works beautifully for the software space, because you know what? You get something out, and if it's not perfect, then you'll learn what's not perfect about it, and you can iterate on that. But so many teams get hung up on trying to find the perfect decisions or the perfect strategy, and it holds them back.
Yeah, it's very much that sort of thing of what I was going to say is I really like it when people do you know what, the research to find out the answer to this isn't worth it. We could find out the answer to this, but it's not good enough. We need to, or it's going to take too much work, and we could just build it and we'll know the answer pretty quickly after that.
I also wanted to ask you about operating in a domain that isn't necessarily your core domain. You've had experience with this. You've moved into spaces that you weren't trained in, you don't have domain knowledge in. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is the current role that I'm in, which has been a great learning experience, because I've previously always been B2C, sorry. I decided to take my first B2C role. Sorry, I've said that the wrong way around. I decided to take my first B2B role, and I went in as an individual contributor, and not that long afterwards got promoted not through my work, but through a vacancy to product director. And it's in cloud infrastructure, primarily around Kubernetes management. If anyone on the call knows anything about managing Kubernetes, what you'll probably know is it's really rather complicated. And if you're not from a technical background, it's almost impossible to, I am never going to be the domain expert within the business on this stuff. I've never been a DevOps before. No, you don't actually have DevOps. DevOps are not people, really. It's a process. People just call themselves that. Now I'm getting into quibbly things.
Controversial. I like it.
Yeah. Going into that space and then going, how do I actually add value here? It's been enormously, I think, beneficial for me. I'm a little bit of a know-it-all at times, just a wee bit. I think I usually pick up things quite quickly, and actually there are advantages to that, but there's also a massive disadvantage, which is that you suddenly think you know more than you might think you know more than you do, and it often inhibits curiosity, or it means you miss opportunities to be more curious about things. When you have no idea about anything, it's very easy to be curious. You don't need to go, oh, let's go and explore this. I actually have no idea what we're talking about here. We're going to have to go back to baby steps, and everyone help bring Lucy along for this. But then trying to figure out how to actually add value in that and make sure that you're trying to understand how other people are thinking about problems, what perspectives they might be missing, and how you can bring people together to have the right kinds of conversations is a really interesting kind of exercise to go, I'm not the domain expert. I can't actually make any strong decisions on this. Occasionally now, after 18 months, I'm getting a few opinions. Yeah. I can bring in the user research we're doing, or the kind of key themes, and shape those conversations to be the right sort of things. But when it gets down into the technical details of stuff, it's like, no, I'm never going to understand that. Yeah. So,
and so yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, because it's just made me think a lot more about the way I think. I think when I previously thought I've been being suitably curious, realizing how much I was underplaying that.
Yeah. I'm just checking. Are we still? Yeah, I'm still a little bit.
Still okay.
Shaker. Yeah, okay, cool. I was going to ask you, what do you do when you have an opinionated founder who's perhaps domain expert, or perhaps thinks they're domain experts, and they've got lots of ideas, and you've got to work with them as a product manager? I
tend to think it's a really good thing if your founder is a domain expert, because let's face it, most people who are working at a startup, unless it's super successful and are going to hang around for a long time to go through an exit and all that stuff, will be there for a couple of years or however long it is. But founders, if you're starting a company, you're saying, I'm going to be doing this for a long time. How long have you been a founder for? It's usually a decade or more's commitment that you're kind of making and going, I do this. And mostly people do it in a domain they care about. Look at you. You care about roadmaps. And product managers. I often hear people, there's this sort of little, or I get worried how often I hear people going, oh, my founder wants to do this, but I don't agree with it. And there's this combative relationship between PMs and founders. And I say, hang on, how credible is the founder in this space? They've chosen to work in it. They're choosing usually to put an awfully large financial and life commitment into it. Are they actually credible in their knowledge? Now, they might come up with ideas that are maybe not quite right, but they've usually got some sort of vision or some sort of understanding. If, on the other hand, you have a founder who is not credible, or is not knowledgeable about the domain, then there better be some other reason why you're working for them, because otherwise I would probably go, maybe they're a really good leader and they're really good at bringing other people together. In that case, you shouldn't have too much of an issue working with them. If they're neither of those things, then why are you putting your career in their hands? But if they are that kind of credible, knowledgeable person about this sort of stuff, it's a case of work. How do you make them better? How do you complement them? They'll have ideas. How do you take those ideas and move it through? And I think one of the things I've been doing is doing kind of continuous discovery type activities and being able to reflect that back and challenge the thinking and engage in that debate and go, okay, how do you see this fitting? And actually making sure it's also very easy for founders to get a little bit removed from the actual product and think it's different from what it actually is. And so bringing them closer to it, you've got to get quite big before you can justify an air gap between a founder and the kind of flagship product of their business.
As you said, even Bezos was involved in the big strategic steps. I don't think founders ever get the ability to step away entirely, do they?
No, there is a reason that Amazon is the way it is, and it is largely because they have had consistency of decision making, because all big decisions and all of the culture is based off one person. Yeah, and that has been cascaded through the organization. It's changing a bit now, but
that's interesting. Yeah, but you're right. It's such a key facet of some of these big companies, and also it makes it their weakest point as well. If anything, if management changes or if anything happens there, you can see what happened with Apple after Steve Jobs died. Unfortunately, it was just, it hasn't been the same company. But I guess you're not seeing that consistency of decision making, that consistency of standards across the board.
Yeah, I do wonder what he would have done with it.
Yeah,
I do wonder whether there'd be an Apple metaverse.
Oh wow, I didn't thought of Apple metaverse, but yeah,
if anyone was going to do it well, they would do it well.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. That could be a good one. They don't have necessarily the whole user base, but certainly the experience.
They've got the attention to detail and the quality that,
yeah. And Sarah says apparently they're working on it, so there's that.
Yeah, they've got enough money to, haven't they?
Yeah. Now, other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, as a PM, like you mentioned in a chat earlier that you've been covering a design role for a while. How's this been? What's this brought up?
So because I'm at a startup again, it's a small team and having a bit of a gap on design, I've been getting back into my roots I left being a designer because I was a UX person, because basically I was a bit shit at it. And isn't that where all people who aren't great at UX end up being product managers? I don't know.
We all had our janky path through.
Yeah.
You know,
But it was quite interesting to go and get back into doing design and building things, and actually just the sheer joy of, sorry, that's my dog barking in the background, and actually figuring stuff out at a building level. I spend time, lots of conversations, lots of writing, all of those sorts of things. I think there's enormous value in figuring out how stuff works. But maybe it's a Figma prototype or something like that. It's like quite low level stuff, but the mechanics of building things, it's really good to get, or certainly I found it quite energizing and interesting to get back into that and actually start to remember actually what is involved, and just the toil and the labor and the design decisions. And when you make a decision about doing something a particular way, suffering the consequences of that 3 days later when you go, oh, I built this Excel spreadsheet and I thought having 32 sheets that all referenced each other was a great idea, and now I'm trying to find out where this little damn circular reference is that's going around and breaking everything. And just building that kind of engineering and builder sympathy for me is something that I haven't seen a lot of people talking about it lately. I think I wonder if there's something that's happening in that a lot of people have fallen into product management, I guess, from a bit of a builder background, but now you're getting people coming in from being product managers very early in their careers and not necessarily having that experience. And I wonder whether there's just something missing there of spending time doing that, putting stuff together, actually working through features in terms of wireframes, and whether we should be encouraging people to do that more, just to round out more of their understanding of the process and build empathy for other roles.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It gives you that tinkering. And I think a lot of us product people are tinkerers at heart, right? We're pulling apart our electronics at home when we were kids and getting in trouble for it. But getting into the stuff that we're building, just learning how the flows work, creating something and seeing it fail, seeing it work, seeing what the different constraints are, it builds your knowledge of how things work, because I know it's so easy to get to step away from that stuff and miss how that works, particularly as you move up the ladder as a product person, but also helps build empathy with the people who are building. Having done the early days coding of ProdPad, I now understand that there's nothing quite as simple as I might have once thought. Having dabbled in bits of whether it's email flows, campaign type stuff. I now understand how automating emails is so difficult, right? There's all these things that I've had my fingers in over the years that I now realize, okay, yeah, so this is why we hire professionals. We trust them with their jobs,
Yeah.
with the jobs we give them. And that's why it's really important.
Yeah, and it's why, like, when you go, this should be really simple, it's really easy to knock this together, I could do it, and then you start to get into it and you're like, oh yeah, okay, there's a little bit more depth here than I thought there was.
This is something that our co-founder Simon, he suggested this to me really early on, before we even had team members, when he was giving me some advice on dealing with my team way back when. And he said, never call something simple. It can be straightforward or complex. Straightforward meaning it has a known answer and it's just a task to be done, whereas complex is it needs to be broken down, but nothing's ever simple.
Yeah, I remember working with an engineering team once, and I was like, okay, we need to, this is getting into like super detailed stuff. If there's some button, there's some text on that button and it needs to wrap across 2 lines because the button's too long.
Yeah.
And they're just like, that's going to take us 2 weeks. Do you really want it that much? That's the reason we haven't done it. And it's like, how can that take 2 weeks? They did explain it to me. I was a little perplexed by that, but the tool, the application wasn't designed to do that. It wasn't just an HTML application, but and so it had some constraints, and it was like, this is surprisingly.
It's amazing what you learn as you get under.
Yeah, there's all the stuff that they could do like that, and you're like, oh, that's really cool. I thought that was going to take weeks, and you did that in 5 minutes. Awesome. So I'm just going to shut up on estimates and not talk about that anymore.
Yeah. This is probably a good time to wrap. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining today for this conversation. I found it really enlightening and a lot of fun. So thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.